Switch to Verizon Business and get more from your internet without paying more for your internet. Get LTE Business Internet starting at $39 a month when paired with select business mobile plans. That's unlimited data, and with it, unlimited possibilities. Start saving today with Verizon Business, ranked #1 in small business internet customer satisfaction by J.D. Power. Starting price for 25 megabits per second LTE internet plan with smartphone plan savings, plus taxes, fees, and economic adjustment charge. Terms apply. For J.D. Power 2024 award information, visit jdpower.com/awards.
Spring is here, and you can now get almost anything you need for your sunny days delivered with Uber Eats. What do we mean by almost? Well, you can't get a well-groomed lawn delivered, but you can get a chicken parmesan delivered. A cabana? That's a no. But a banana? That's a yes. A nice tan? Sorry, nope. But a box fan? Happily, yes. A day of sunshine? No. A box of fine wines? Yes. Uber Eats can definitely get you that. Get almost anything delivered with Uber Eats. Order now. Alcohol in select markets. Product availability may vary by region. See app for details.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Dr. Psych Mom Show. Today, we're going to talk about this common idea among depressed people who are unhappily married that their depression is solely related to their spouse, and it's not. And I've done a podcast on this before, but I have so many other listeners, new listeners, that, you know, I've realized, my husband has pointed out too, that most people don't see all my content. So just as an aside, I always hesitate to kind of redo podcasts or even videos, because I think that the core followers will be like, oh, like, why are you doing this again? Even if you're riffing on it, even if it includes some new stuff. But in reality, most people don't get I have so much content out, I have like probably 10 videos a day, a post every week on drpsychmom.com. I have multiple podcast episodes out every week. So there's no way for everybody to keep up on all the content. But if you want to go back and listen to the other one about this, it was, does depression go away if you remarry a more supportive spouse? So a little bit of a different angle, and you can listen to that one as well. And also, please do subscribe, so that, speaking of all my content, so that you could get 200 extra episodes, and the link to subscribe is in the episode descriptions as well as in the description of the entire podcast on Spotify. You get 200 more episodes for $8.99 a month, which I think is really a very good deal. Okay, so a lot of people come in and they say that their depression is because of their spouse. This is really pernicious, right? Because then you think that if you get divorced, then your depression goes away, which is why I had that in the literal headline of the prior podcast that I mentioned. It doesn't. Your depression doesn't go away when you remarry a more supportive spouse, or it wasn't really depression. It was you were sad. You can be sad. You're definitely sad if your marriage isn't going well. But if you have clinical levels of depression, most people do not have one episode of major depression. Okay? Most people have recurring depression. And the reason that they may not think so is because they don't go back into their history. They don't sit with a therapist and think, well, shit, actually, I fell down. I guess maybe that was depression, even starting in college. I was drinking a lot then, so I guess I thought that maybe that was the issue. Then, of course, when my job wasn't going well in my 20s, that too. And, when I think about it, I probably did have postpartum, if it's a woman, obviously, and whatever. So most people, unfortunately, and I'm somebody who also has had multiple episodes and recurring depression as well, as I've shared numerous times, it's usually not one episode, right? Some people do have one episode, but your spouse in your marriage, they don't usually they can't create an episode of major depressive disorder. Yes, there's situational triggers for getting into an episode, but you have to have an underlying diathesis. That's called like a predisposition. The diathesis stress model of mental illness. You have a predisposition, and then a stressor creates an episode, right? So you have a predisposition for depression, probably a family history of depression. Maybe you just thought your parents were angry or negative or assholes, but they were probably depressed if you are. And yes, the marriage can exacerbate any sort of mental illness if it's bad, just like parenting a difficult child can plunge you into an episode of depression if you have an underlying predisposition for depression, and it's probably not going to be the only episode you have. So should you work on your marriage? Certainly. Of course, I'm a couples therapist. I work with individuals and couples. Obviously, improving your marriage may allow you to feel more in control of yourself, less upset, and at some point you may even get out of your episode of major depression, right? But even though your spouse maybe now know how to be more loving and supportive, you're probably, unfortunately, still going to have other episodes of depression. When the seasons change according to your cycle, when there's hormonal shifts, when some bad shit happens at work, when there are parenting issues. If you're somebody who struggles with depression, then stressors plunge you into depression, because you have that underlying predisposition. And you can't make your life have zero stressors. So since I've just tried to tell you that your depression is not due to your marriage, why should you work on your marriage? Well, shit, don't you want to have a healthy marriage? You can be a depressed person, by the way, in a healthy marriage. You can be somebody who struggles with depression physiologically, fatigue and sleep issues, and either overeating and oversleeping or undereating and undersleeping, depending on what kind of depression you have, rejection sensitivity, increased pain intolerance. All these things go along with depression. I have a lot of stuff on depression that you should listen to and read. But, you could have all those things but not feel like you hate your partner. And not feel like your marriage sucks. The same as you could be depressed and still love your child and feel that your child is a good child. So it would be much the same, and people have to do more analogies between their spouse and their kids. Because whenever I do analogies with the kid, everybody's like, oh, I guess so. Like the big one that I do is like, oh, would you ever tell your child that they should feel the same after puberty as before puberty? Of course not. That'd be like child abuse. Oh, why don't you play with your Barbies? You're 15 years old. Why don't you play with your Barbies instead of going to prom? I like it better when you play with your Barbies. No, that's crazy. This like Netflix movie, crazy psychological drama shit, right? But yet guys are like, oh, why don't you feel the same after menopause? Well, shit, I don't know. Why doesn't your daughter feel the same after puberty as before? But anyway, so these analogies are very good with children and frequently make people have huge epiphanies as to how fairly or unfairly they've been treating a spouse. But this one, people aren't like, oh yeah, I guess if I'm parenting a difficult child, I also get depressed. Oh, I guess if things are going well with parenting, then I'm still depressed. I've still been depressed. Things were going well with having elementary school kids. That's always everybody's favorite age. But I still did struggle with seasonal depression. So I guess those are separate orthogonal constructs, whether or not I'm depressed and how a relationship is going. Now, I can be sad and angry. Of course, you have emotions based on how your relationship is going. But these people, and I just did a podcast on this a few days ago, so it must be my topic of the moment. But people are saying, that there's only one way to respond to a relationship issue, such as like sex life lessening over time. That was a prior podcast. And it's depression, panic, and blame, that's it. Like that's your only options. Can't possibly be anything more balanced, accepting, loving. No, of course not. It would be whenever somebody says, well, of course, if of course X happened to me, so of course I felt like this. What of course? Not everybody feels the same for everything that happens. As I overstate, Viktor Frankl wrote Man's Search for Meaning in Auschwitz. I'm guessing he's in the tail of the normal distribution of how productive a person could be in Auschwitz, obviously. So there's a range of ways for people to respond to very, very, very difficult situations. There's a range of ways for people to respond to their kid being terminally ill. There is a normal distribution, and most of how you respond is based on nature plus nurture from your upbringing. How did you see parents respond to things, plus how are you wired to respond? And if you are plunged into a depression by your marital issues, this means that you struggle with depression. And your parents probably did too, and they gave you the idea that because some bad thing happens, you are supposed to be literally depressed. Not sad, not transiently sad or angry, not try to fix it. Those are adaptive responses, but plunge into a hopeless, negative, cynical depression. That is shit that you learned at home. And you can unlearn it, but only if you open your mind. Right now, you have a golden opportunity to open your mind and see this differently. And say, you know what? My spouse could be good, my spouse could be bad. You know what? I'd probably still be depressed. And in the springtime, when the weather changes, I'm probably not going to be depressed. even if they're still an asshole. And that opens you up to take some agency and autonomy and to say, you know what, I got to work on my mental health for me. Separately, I also want to have a healthy marriage, and I want to model that for my children, And if this marriage doesn't work out, I'm probably going to struggle with depression in the next marriage too, even if it's a better marriage. So really what I ought to do, you would continue to yourself, after you've been mobilized into action from this clarion call of a podcast, you would say, I am going to work on my own depression. How do I deal with that? How do I accept that it will probably recur while coping with it in adaptive ways, working on the cognitive aspect of it? By the way, you can have all the same physiological symptoms of depression that recur. Kind of a third of people have treatment-resistant depression, meaning that they have such bad side effects or they don't respond to medications or to therapy, doesn't impact the biological piece. And I'm sure that the research that comes out in years and years will show us that there's a huge brain difference and everything in people that struggle with recurring depression. But anyway, point is you can have recurring depression, but not have as much of the cognitive symptoms, that hopelessness, the depressive triad of negative thoughts about self, world, and future. That stuff is what could be worked on in therapy. And that stuff, remember, if you're depressed, you were raised by depressive parents, most likely. Everything has a huge genetic component, which most people undersell. And, it's in our Western world, everybody believes that you come out, of your parents' home and then you're a whole new person. No, you're not. You got their genetics, you got their behaviors, you got their worldviews, whether you rail against them or not, and the silliest thing that somebody could do is diminish the impact of how they were raised, because it really, makes you throw out money truly in therapy and books and everything if you don't literally say, oh, if a dog was raised in a certain environment, I would say, oh, I guess that dog learned that trick with their prior owner. But then I don't say, oh, I guess I learned to be cynical and nasty by my parents, and it's just such a cognitive deficit. It really is a gap in your understanding of yourself, your ability to empathize, your ability to move forward in the world, to not understand this. So anyway, most people are coming from a depressive family, both genetically and with behaviors, and then they bring that into their relationships. And also then they don't understand how those depressive behaviors perpetuate the dysfunction in the marriage. That hopeless, helpless, cynical, angry, irritable style, as well as the fatigue and the lack of drive and everything, all drives, sex, regular, everything. So point being, your depression is not contingent on the spouse, and it's not contingent on the marriage. The marriage can make things worse if you already tend in a certain direction. Work on your depression, work on your marriage separately. That's the best case. That's when I see the best outcomes in people, is they come in, they say, I'm a person who struggles with depression, or let's say anxiety, or childhood trauma, or OCD, or whatever, right? ADHD, whatever. And then separately, I want to work here on my marriage, learning better skills to be a better partner. Not expecting a fantasy of all these medications don't work to make me feel better, if the person even admits that they have recurring depression. But nothing has ever made me feel better, but I know what would if my spouse became perfect. No. You love your kid, right? You love your kid, and they don't make you not struggle, right? I mean, you may love your job, and that doesn't make you not struggle. If you struggle, you struggle, and you have to see it as like something that crosses arenas. There's almost nobody I've ever seen who struggles in their marriage and then doesn't struggle with some aspect of parenting. And then they often say it's because the child that they struggle with is like the spouse, and then there's no kind of awareness like I struggle myself, given a negativistic style and outlook, I struggle with how to engage in a proactive, non-blaming, positive, healthy way with everybody in my life, And while I can keep it together at work or with friendships, when I'm seeing somebody every day, every moment, I too, given my negative style, contribute in certain ways to the marital issues, to the parenting issues, to whatever the case may be. And it's not to say that your spouse is not making things worse, because they probably are, and you probably have an unhealthy relationship for all the reasons I've said, but you got to see those things separately. Both people, their own mental health issues are separate from the marriage. And just this tweak in your outlook can be transformative and can really remove the brakes from all of the efforts you've been putting in, right? Because there's people who are depressed that are putting in all this effort to couples counseling, but they're putting like no effort. If they're even going to individual counseling, they're putting in much less effort there, mostly using individual counseling to bitch about couples counseling, and the reality is it should be exactly the opposite. The individual therapy, if you have to put more of your effort in one, it should be the individual therapy to understand yourself, your triggers, your style, the way that you interact. I mean, that's the money shot there. Understanding who you are, getting comfortable with who you are, understanding the links between your childhood, your family of origin, the deficits in how you were loved and cared for through no fault of your parents, because they are people and they struggle with their own issues. How did that impact you, your ability to give and receive love, your outlook, again, your depression or anxiety or ADHD or whatever else? That's the money shot, the self-awareness, the self-exploration, which can then lead to objective understanding of your contribution, real, true desire to see what would change if in fact you changed your worldview versus waiting on your spouse. There's just so much that can happen there. You're almost like you're getting rid of the bottleneck. This perspective that the spouse is at the root of your mental health issues is a bottleneck, and it stops you from engaging in the real work of, self-transformation, which is why people come into therapy, both couples or individuals, is they want to transform the way that they exist in the world and their relationships. And this almost kind of superstitious perspective that one person could screw up your mental health unilaterally, it's just not right. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed this. It's something you should listen to again, honestly. I mean, especially if you felt triggered by it, you're like, no way. My wife not having sex with me is why I'm depressed. No way. My husband being an asshole is why I'm depressed. No, listen to it again. Actually think about it. Actually think about the times in your life. Never has somebody just been so happy, so wonderful. They've been dancing through the meadow with the unicorns. Their childhood was like the Brady Bunch, actually, that was kind of a little dysfunctional. I think both of their parents died in the Brady Bunch, and it was a blended family. So leave it to Beaver or what have you. And then all of a sudden, there were no warning signals. They just ended up with this complete asshole. Man, just out of the clear blue sky, this asshole fell down, forced them in gunpoint to marry them, and now they're depressed. That is not accurate. Of course, I'm hyperbolizing, but for hopefully entertainment effect. And you got to rethink that assumption. All right. And as always, if y'all need therapy or coaching, reach out to me or my team, bestlifebehavioralhealth.com. And please do subscribe to get 200 extra episodes, and I'll talk to y'all soon. Have a great day, guys.